So, coach, I know that there's a lot of coaches know who you are right now, but still, like, can you introduce yourself for the coaches in Taiwan and Asia?
Certainly, certainly. My name is Loren Seagrave. I've been fortunate enough to coach athletics or track and field for the last 50 years. I started out when I was 3 years old, and of course I didn't. But my areas of expertise are typically sprints and hurdles and horizontal jumps. Although I've coached just about everything except for pole vault and hammer throw. Um, Worked in the university system in the United States for many years, finished at Louisiana State University after winning 5 national championships and setting them off on a long streak of outdoor championship wins under my former assistant coaches. Then basically turned pro and started working with elite athletes. I've had the joy and being blessed by being able to lecture and teach literally all over the world and coach in countries like Brazil and Thailand, Australia, and also worked with many other athletes. For example, the Chinese national sprint team from 2011 through 2017.
Nice. It's a shame that we didn't invite you. So,
They tried. They tried a couple times, as a matter of fact.
so uh, today I kind of want to focus about like sprinting. Is that okay?
Certainly.
So first question would be like for like sprinters or as I learned to like sprint nowadays, there's like certain like drills like march drill we can use to warm up. So what are your thoughts on like how does these like march drill affects our movement pattern when we like do the high speed running?
Yeah, I think you probably mean mock drills, which were kind of introduced by Gerard Mock many years ago, famous Polish sprint coach that moved to Canada temporarily and then went to Japan and then came back to Canada and coached in Canada for many, many years. And what Gerard tried to do is tried to systematize some of the teaching and learning progressions that will help athletes understand how to better modify their motor pattern. However, now that was a very long time ago, and the system has progressed considerably since then. I'm sitting here in Budapest, Hungary, where I'm the national coach for men's and women's 4x100 meter relay. And I see all the time people doing similar drills to what Gerard Mock did, but they don't necessarily facilitate changing of the motor pattern and increasing sprinting efficiency. They're limbering up drills, and they might warm your nervous system up a little bit. But the way most of the exercises are done actually give you negative information to put into your nervous system, which then creates a less efficient movement pattern.
So how exactly does we need to change the drill to like help us have a better performance in like sprinting or better like information for our neural system?
So the first thing is to be able to understand that the most important phase of sprinting is while you're on the ground. Because once you leave the ground, unless you have jet propulsion, you can no longer accelerate. And so the ground phase is the most important phase. If you want to have a perfect ground phase, the phase which precedes it, ground preparation phase, must also be perfect. And if you want a perfect ground preparation phase, then you have to have a perfect recovery phase. And if you want to have a perfect recovery phase, you have to have a perfect ground phase. And so you see, it's a cyclical thing that happens. And so when we start to change and reprogram the nervous system, we start at takeoff. And takeoff is extremely important because you have to get the leg from the back side of the body to the front side of the body as soon as possible and as fast as possible. There's a difference between soon and fast. Soon means that the moment you separate the foot from the ground, takeoff, the thigh must come forward. But if you look at so many sprinters, what ends up happening is the thigh continues to go backward, and they're not in contact with the ground, so they're pushing on air. And we've discovered in studies that the last few degrees of hip extension just before you leave the ground produces very, very, very little force relative to what's happening on the front side of the body. And so rather than wasting time and then pushing on the air, we want to get the limb forward as quickly as possible. Now, the muscles that initiate hip flexion when the thigh is behind the body are the two joint hip flexors. So you have the rectus femoris, the sartorius, and the tensor fasciae lata. You also have single joint hip flexors, which most of us recognize as being the iliopsoas and the pectineus and glute minimus, and to some extent glute medius. But the muscles that initiated that are the two joint muscles. They cross the knee and they cross the hip. So if you want to produce force at the hip, you have to momentarily fix or stabilize the knee joint. And so one of the drills that is pervasive around the world teaches the athlete to bend the knee at takeoff and to flex the knee at takeoff. These are typically called butt kickers. And we used to do these. We advocated doing these for many, many years until I was listening to a presentation by a physiotherapist, and he talked about active insufficiency. And that's where you have a two joint muscle and you try to produce force at the superior joint, but the lower leg moves. It's like trying to pull on a rope that's not attached to anything. And so we've taken the butt kicking drills out of it. Now, I'm sitting here in Hungary, and as we travel around a competition, we still see athletes doing it. And so it's probably the worst thing that an athlete can do. What we advocate is to thigh pop. And so we basically practice kicking people in the shins. And so yesterday I was working with two junior sprinters, and what I had them do is stand next to the pole vault pit, very close, and pop the thigh forward as if you're going to kick somebody very quickly in the shins and not be noticed by the referee so they don't throw you out, give you the red card. And so we practice that, and then we practice thigh pop with arm punch. So we kick them in the shin and we punch them in the chin. And so we learn how to do this on one side, and then we learn a 2 count where they go pop, pop, and then a 3 count, and then rapid fire, and then we have them start to move forward in this ankling action, an old drill, but using thigh pop and arm punch. And then the next thing we ask them is, do you like to go to the beach? And so I stand next to them and say, we're standing on the sand and looking out into the water. And you see that line in front of you? That's where the water starts. So we're going to thigh pop as quick as we can, as fast as we can, down into the water. Then I ask, what has to happen when you get into the water? Well, you have to lift your heel up out of the water. Otherwise, you will fall flat on your face because the water will grab your foot. And so we have them do that, and it turns into a very nice step over run with the foot coming back actively underneath the body. And this is the fundamental teaching progression that we use to teach maximum velocity sprinting. And so just lifting the knee is not going to get you where you want to go.
So for the drill side of stuff, is it kind of like people used to do things like A skip, B skip, but nowadays in the state they call it like switches? Is it that? Can I understand it this way?
Well, so A skip and B skip are the mock drills. And again, the way people typically organize it, they lift their knee up and then push back down, which isn't the way you initiate the thigh coming forward. And so I can imagine what switches might be is you're standing on one leg and you drive into the ground with the leg that's flexed and then pop the other one up and then come back down again. Again, that doesn't initiate the movement the way it has to happen in sprinting. And so you can do different progressions. For example, we teach an exercise called fast leg. It's different than we used to teach it. When you make the fast leg movement, which is a cyclical action coming from takeoff back down to the ground, you have to execute it with the thigh pop initially, then step over and then pull the leg back. Once you're able to do it on one side and the other side, then we link it to a bilateral movement. And then we combine it with straight leg bounding. Straight leg bounding, alternate fast leg is one of the most specific exercises you can do that really will transfer over to sprinting.
Love that.
So basically, we don't use the mock drills much anymore.
Love that. Love that. So, in order to do warm-ups or like things like you mentioned, like straight leg bounding. I'm sorry about that. Uh, can you like give us some other movements that you would do besides like things you just
So,
mentioned?
well, you can do different kinds of dynamic skipping, but you have to get the thigh to pop forward and then to actively pull back. Side slide is a good exercise because it's a multi-planar exercise. Sprinters basically are sagittal plane athletes. You know, it's front to back. They're going to go forward. And so consequently, the development of the muscles that are prime movers in the other planes, but secondary movers in the sagittal plane are oftentimes underdeveloped and are oftentimes the ones that get injured. And so different types of movements like that, sliding and that type of thing, we use a galloping as a movement where you pretend like you may have a broom in between your knees and your one foot is out in front and you're getting the kind of a galloping rhythm. And then the power gallop, you step over the opposite knee and pull back. And so that's a fundamental exercise that will increase the blood flow, but at the same time, you're working on reprogramming the nervous system.
Cool. Love this. Love this. So, uh, beside the mock drill you mentioned, is there like certain like drills or like accessory work you're gonna work on when you're gonna do when you train like sprinters for their like coordination or like motor control when it comes to like high speed running because it's such a high like it's so demanding for the central nervous system and at the end of the 100-meter sprint like athlete always like get zigzag or it's like yeah so is do you do something to like help them to keep like
Well, so I think that there's a real important thing that I have to share is people use the word drill. And what a drill is you go through a pattern movement in an almost mindless fashion. And just, you just go through it because, okay, we do it and we're just going to do the exercise. We're going to go through it. We're not thinking very much about it. And that is not the way to approach reprogramming the nervous system. You can't be doing an exercise thinking about what you're going to have for dinner tonight. You have to be focused on the movement and not only executing the movement, but getting feedback from all the sensory receptors to check the quality of the movement. And so we use teaching progressions and learning routines. And so the ones that we use the most, I've already kind of gone over them. I don't have a ton of different exercises that we're going to do just to do them. There needs to be a very specific purpose. Now, as far as what you're seeing at the end of 100 meters, basically you're going to reach your absolute maximum velocity, and after about 8 seconds, you start to see a deceleration. If you're Usain Bolt, after 8 seconds, you're almost at the finish line. But if you're a young sprinter running 13 seconds, you've still got a ways to go. Now, why does deceleration happen? Deceleration happens because you can no longer put an adequate or a big force in the ground in the same short amount of time because of either central nervous system fatigue, or you're running out of energy in order to cause muscle contraction in the muscle. And so what you end up doing is you end up buying more time on the ground. And so what we see is characteristically is step length increases where step frequency decreases. And the reason for that is the athlete puts their foot further out in front of their center of mass, giving them more front side distance, which probably also increases braking forces. So the time on the ground is increased in order to try to apply the same amount of force, but you need more time to do it. And so the whole concept is, okay, how can I reprogram the nervous system in order to try to avoid this tendency to overreach with the foot? And so what we do is we create a race model. And so that race model has 6 different parts: the start, pure acceleration, transition, maximum velocity 1, maximum velocity 2, and speed maintenance. Notice I didn't call it the deceleration phase. We're trying to maintain the speed. And of course, we have to teach the finish. So that's really a 7th portion of this movement. And so each phase, we have a cue that the athlete thinks about. And it's not always the same for every athlete. For example, in the acceleration phase, we either think punch, 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 or push, push, push. Most people need punch, punch, punch because they're over pushing. Again, the leg is going back forward or back in extension while the foot is not on the ground. So we want to have the arms punch forward to try to get the thighs to pop forward. The last phase, the speed maintenance phase, the cue is hot track. And so it's like running across an asphalt parking lot at 100 degrees or 40 degrees Celsius with the sun beating down on it barefoot. So you got to work on getting your heels up, getting your thighs popping forward, and stepping over as well as you possibly can, and getting the foot back down to the ground quickly, and not allow it to reach out and go forward. And so there's a conscious effort to be able to do this. Now, if you don't have the energy system, and the key here is delta lactate. How quickly can your glycolytic system ramp up? Most of the time it takes a couple seconds. Sprinters that train this system on a regular basis, the glycolytic system starts kicking in after 1 second. And if an untrained sprinter or a poorly trained sprinter, the slope of the ramp up of the glycolytic system is relatively flat or not steep, whereas the well-trained sprinter has a vertical ascent in terms of the glycolytic system's contribution to energy, and creates much more energy through the glycolytic system, which then allows the athlete to maintain their speed after 8 seconds.
So that's why like athletes like Usain Bolt that can like maintain their speed, or like no allows they can maintain their speed at the end of like 100-meter sprint, right?
Well, the reason is they're running a heck of a lot faster than a 13-second sprinter. And so if you start to see this energy depletion around 8 seconds, they're almost at the finish line. So they're maintaining the speed because they're getting there so much sooner. But if you have the 13-second young sprinter, they still have 5 seconds to go to try to maintain the speed. So it's all about duration and not number of meters.
Cool. So I know this is not on the question list. I sent it to you, but since you mentioned that there's like 6 phases of like sprinting or like 7 phases, can you like go through like all those like 6 phases? What would you be looking at and like the coaching cue?
Absolutely. So the start is the first phase. That includes reaction time, force application on the blocks, and the first 2 steps, because the first 2 steps are decidedly different than the rest of acceleration. The what we were working on yesterday with 2 other sprinters was block starts, and they didn't quite understand that you have to push with both legs. The first movement needs to be banging the rear block such that you start to displace the center of mass forward. Do you know what typically the first movement is of a sprinter? They lift their head up. So we know they've heard the gun because they've moved, but their center of mass is still in the same place that it was. So this is a non-productive movement. We want to teach them how to have a productive first movement, because people lose sometimes 4 or 5 hundredths of a second just because the head moves and they're still sitting there. So we get them to bang the rear block, and then we get them to yank that foot forward such that it stays close to the ground. Remember, as soon as you bend your knee, you turn off the 2-joint hip flexors. And if you have the heel come up, what ends up happening is it takes a longer time, but then as you prepare to strike the ground, the foot is actually moving forward into the ground, which creates braking forces rather than coming back into the ground. The force application on the block, depending on the level of the sprinter, is somewhere between 0.22 seconds to 0.26 or 27 seconds for some of the female athletes. The air time on the first step has to be between 0.05 seconds and 0.07 seconds. And the first ground phase has to be between 0.13 seconds and 0.15 seconds. So let's say you're 5 hundredths of a second in the air and 15 hundredths of a second on the ground. That's 0.2 seconds. What's the instantaneous step frequency? 2/10, 4/10, 6/10, 8/10 a dollar. That's 5 steps per second right out of the blocks. Now, the traditional thinking is step frequency starts out low and gradually increases as velocity increases. Not with the best starters in the world. Step frequency starts out high and then is maintained throughout the course of the race as much as possible. So pure acceleration is from the start to about 15 meters. Okay, it's about the first 2 seconds. And so if you have a young athlete, that may be 10 meters, but the first then you have to kind of open that up a little bit. So the first 2 seconds, about 15 meters. So the athlete is going to take a breath in as they go up into the set position, and then the movement that they're going to make when they hear the gun, which is called a motor set rather than a sensory set, is to bang the rear block. When they do that, they continue to hold their breath, because you can produce much more force by holding your breath than blowing it out. When you blow the air out, you decrease the intra-abdominal pressure, and so you don't have such a stable spine anymore. The other thing is when you blow the air out, rather than hold your breath, you decrease the intracarotid pressure. And when the pressure is high in the carotid artery, this sets off baroreceptors in the carotid body that go up in synapse in the brain with facilitatory neurons in the brain that inhibit the inhibitors, really is what happens, which allows you to increase more motor units to fire. So you're able to generate more force. That's why people, if you're going for a max in the bench press, you don't blow the air out. You hold your breath. But it's also why it's dangerous, because it increases the pressure to the brain. So the cue that we use in acceleration is push, 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 or pop, pop, pop. And so most of the time we're trying to get the thigh forward. And so we use either pop or punch. If we're going to focus on the hands coming forward to facilitate the thigh coming forward on the opposite side, we're going to talk about punch. When we get to 15 meters, the air comes out and goes back in again very quickly. And we continue then to hold the breath through the next phase, which is called the transition phase. This is where the athlete's transitioning from pure acceleration mechanics to pure maximum velocity mechanics. It typically lasts 4 to 5 seconds. And so we use 35 meters as the end of the transition zone. The out, when the breath comes out, is about 5 meters, we figure. It's quicker than that usually. And then you go into maximum velocity. The cue for transition phase is drive taller. Now, drive typically means hip extension. I'm going to continue to push back and try to increase my velocity. But as I do, I go from, say, 35-degree angle as the athlete comes out of the blocks. We used to think it was 45. It's not. The best ones come out at 35. And that then gradually gets more vertical as velocity gets closer to the maximum. And then you're at your tallest point when you reach maximum velocity. So the whole concept of drive, continue to feel hip extension as your body gets taller. We don't have the athlete try to keep their head down and stay forward and that type of thing. I was listening to John Drummond speak one time, one of the great sprinters in the John Smith camp, and he was talking about head position, and he said, we used to run and try to keep our chin on our chest, so to speak. What I know now after coaching is we were just running with our head down. We really didn't have to do that, but it was a cue that we thought would help us keep a lower position longer. So then the breath at 35, back in at 40, maximum velocity 1. So what we're thinking here now is your body's pretty vertical, and what we're going to do is we're going to try to step over the opposite knee. This is a cue that Tony Wells used for years and years, where the ankle crosses above the support leg knee. This ensures a tight lever and a high thigh block, but it all has to start by the thigh popping forward, the thigh moving forward at takeoff. We can't leave the thigh back at all. Otherwise, we'll never be able to get to the optimal position. Maximum velocity 2. This is typically at 60 meters. Well, how fortunate. Our race model actually can be set up, and it's a 60-meter dash, which is typically the indoor distance that's run. So indoor can be used to rehearse the race model in the first several phases. So maximum velocity 2 goes from 60 meters to about 80 meters. Okay, this is now the zone where some athletes, because of the speed that they're able to generate, are going to be in that kind of speed maintenance phase. But we change the dynamic of the cue. The cue instead of step over is now, which is a recovery mechanics cue, is now grab back, which is a ground preparation cue. So we're trying to take the foot and snatch it back underneath our body, generating as high a negative foot speed as we possibly can, and positioning the foot at touchdown such that it is 1 foot length in front of the anterior iliac spine. So if you take a high-speed film of an athlete and have them at the instant of ground contact, first of all, their knees should be together. The recovery leg knee should not be behind the other one. If it is, then they're too slow off the takeoff. Knees should be together. And if you drop a line down from the anterior superior iliac spine, that bone in the front of your hip, to the ground, it should intersect with the heel of the foot. So really, your touchdown point is 1 foot length in front of your center of mass. So your high negative foot speed, small front side distance, minimizes ground time, minimizes braking forces. And then from 80 meters, the breath comes out again and goes back in. And the final 15 to 20 meters, they think hot track. And we discussed that as we talked about running barefoot across the parking lot in the middle of the summer. And then finally, you have to practice the finish. And there's typically 2 finish techniques. One's called the trip finish. And this is where both arms are driven back behind the body, which shifts the shoulders more forward and allows the torso to break the finish line a little bit sooner. The other one is the swim finish. And this is where one arm goes back and the other arm punches up and forward. And so that you actually rotate the torso so that the shoulder joint is where the torso is going to be measured from. And you get a little bit of an advantage of this. I remember in 1989 at the LA Times Games, Dawn Soel, up-and-coming sprinter, was racing Gwen Torrance in the 60 meters. They both ran 7.16, which was a new American record at the time. But Gwen used the trip finish, Dawn used the swim finish, and they went down to the thousandths of a second, and they awarded the win to Dawn by virtue of the fact that she used the swim finish rather than the trip finish. Both got the American record, but Dawn got the win.
Love it. So I'm still gonna jump out the question list I sent it to you. So at the acceleration phase you mentioned, instead of like triple extension, you use like thigh popping forward.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, triple extension shouldn't happen in acceleration, because triple extension means hip, knee, and ankle. As soon as you apply contractile force with the ankle, the leg is going to dangle behind your body. And so what we want to do is we want to bang the heel into the block, and we want to rip the thigh out as soon as possible. If you look at the best sprinters in the world, the best starters, you'll see that their leg doesn't reach full extension before they start to recover the leg. So triple extension works in the power clean, not in sprinting.
So there's a like I noticed that there's a lot of like sprint coaches or performance coaches work with sprinters. They use like single leg like RDL or like step up variation, but they like pop the thigh forward. Does that help?
They typically don't pop the thigh forward. They typically lift the knee.
Yeah.
Which is a totally different type of action. You know, your single leg RDL that basically is a hamstring developing exercise. And so that's not going to help you very much. What we do is double or triple step ups. So we have a weight vest on the athlete, and they're carrying some dumbbells in their hand, and then we either stack boxes up, or what we use are basically a set of stairs, and we'll do that. On Friday this week, typically in our session. So what they're going to do is they're going to drop back and do a rear lunge with the left foot in front on the floor before the stairs, before the steps. And then what they're going to do is they're going to explode, and they're going to drive the thigh forward, and they're going to reach up, and they're going to skip 2 steps. Now, the female steeplechaser that I'm helping in the strength room, she doesn't have the power to do 2 steps, and so she only does 1 step. But what doing 2 steps does is it puts the foot a little bit further out in front of the center of mass, so you're getting much more hamstring work combined with glute activation to project the hips up and forward onto the next step. Nice. So we'll do sets of 5. We'll do 5 with the right leg forward on the ground, take a rest, 5 with the left leg forward on the ground, and do 2 to 3 sets like that.
Love it, love it. So I also want to go back to like when we talk about like acceleration. You mentioned that the body angle. So how exactly do we like help our athlete to maintain that lower body? Eventually they're gonna go up, but how exactly gonna let's say help them go through the all acceleration phase with like lower the lower angle?
Yeah, so your smallest angle is going to come as you come out of the starting blocks. And then that angle gradually increases as velocity increases because acceleration decreases. You know, the change in velocity becomes smaller and smaller and smaller until you reach your maximum velocity, and there is relatively no change in velocity. And so the first thing is you have to look at the block position. And what typically I'm seeing with our under 20 sprinters that I've been doing a lot of work with is the shin angle on the front leg is too vertical. And so you have to position the athlete such that the shin angle on both shins is relatively low. And the front knee is at 90 degrees, and the back knee is somewhere around 130, 135 degrees, which is quarter squat position, basically. And you got knees 90 squat or half squat position. You want the shoulders in front of the hands. You have to have the prerequisite shoulder strength and shoulder stabilization ability in order to do that. And you want the hips only slightly higher than the shoulders, and the head and neck are a prolongation of the back. So you should be able to draw a line down the back, and it should just come across the back of the head. It doesn't want to cut the head in half. You don't want to have the head up and the tension on the neck. And so the key point is that the first movement has gotta be banging the rear block. That starts to displace the hips forward because the center of mass is in front of the rear block. If you have the right block position, the center of mass should also be in front of the front block. Now, you'll know that your athlete is applying force with the rear block correctly if you see the front shin sink. So the front shin is going to be at a certain angle. When you bang the rear block, the center of mass starts to go forward. The front shin angle actually goes down. Then you fire the glutes and the quadriceps at the same time. The glutes and the hamstrings, then the quadriceps rather. If the athlete, and this is a typical issue with young athletes, The athlete on the front leg will fire the quadriceps together with the glutes. This actually increases the shin angle and displaces the center of mass vertically. And so you're not going to have a low projection out of the blocks. You're going to have a 45-degree angle or even greater. And so it's the sequence of muscle firing in the initial position that allows the athlete to project out at a much lower angle. Now, the next key thing is you got to recover the leg. So you pop the thigh forward by keeping the foot low and the shin still in a positive angle. The ankle becomes dorsiflexed, and then you fire the glute so that you actively accelerate the thigh into the ground, and the contact point of the foot is behind the hip joint. When that happens, and you continue to fire the hip extensors, then the knee extensors, you maintain a low angle of projection. But the biggest problem is the athlete puts the foot down in front of the center of mass, fires all of the muscles, which includes the quadriceps, and then starts to go even more vertical.
Nice. So for coaches to like teach athlete how to like do these, is it this like the acceleration ladder goes in?
So the acceleration ladder certainly has its place to teach the athlete how to continue to push back against the ground behind your center of mass. And so typically, especially with young athletes now, what we're going to do is we're going to teach this acceleration pattern, but we're going to force them to keep the force application time on the ground very short and to pop the thigh forward, keep the feet low to the ground. And so the way we do that is we might start with the first step being 60 centimeters and then progressively increase each step by 15 centimeters. This is what Gary Winkler many years ago found to be a very effective tool relative to teaching the athlete how to apply the force in a very short period of time and not having the foot out in front of the body. But we've also added keeping the foot low and popping the thigh forward, which you can rehearse. You can rehearse this in every buildup you do in your warm up, which is one of the things that we taught our athletes yesterday. Now, we didn't use an acceleration ladder yesterday, but because they already had the concept of getting the foot behind the body. So then what you do is as the athlete progresses, you move up one rung on the ladder for your starting position. So now it's a 75 centimeter first step, and then another step, which is a 90 centimeter first step. And so typically that's going to be about where most of the developing athletes are going to be as they come out of the blocks. They're maybe going to be 90 centimeters, maybe a little bit more than that on their first step.
Love this, love this. So I'm gonna ask like the glycolytic system, like you mentioned, how exactly do like let's say coaches like me want to train like the novice athlete to help them progress as a sprinter? How exactly can we train their energy system for the 100-meter sprint?
Yeah, so probably the most effective way to train the energy system for a 100-meter sprinter is to do, let me take one step back. You need to be able to maximize your speed and get your speed goals, your maximum velocity goals, before you start doing more speed endurance or special endurance. And so we want to start addressing speed during the general preparation phase. You know, I was talking to some coaches here, and they said, "Oh no, we don't work speed until we get close to competition. You know, we want to work hard and train hard and that kind of thing, but we don't really work a whole lot of speed before in general preparation. This is when you must reprogram the nervous system, because by the time you get to the end of special prep or pre-competition, you want to be dialed in with high degree of running efficiency and that type of thing. So as you get into special prep, you start doing speed endurance and special endurance. Short speed endurance is from 8 seconds to 12 seconds. Longer speed endurance is from 12 seconds to 20 seconds. And so one of the ways that you can start to work this is maximum intensity, somewhere around 12 seconds. And so that might be 100 meters, it might be 120 meters, but whatever distance is for that athlete on relatively long rests. Now, the other way to develop the glycolytic system is to do special endurance 1. So from 20 seconds to 40 seconds. And this is why some coaches choose, even with their 100-meter runners, to do high intensity runs at around 300 meters, because it really demands high level of glycolytic activity. But that develops one end of the spectrum, but it doesn't develop the quick start of the glycolytic system, which is done more with the short speed endurance work.
So the short speed endurance work is more like the 12 seconds or like 15 seconds you mentioned, right?
So 8 to 12 seconds is short speed endurance, because that's 8 seconds is when you're starting to lose the capacity of the creatine phosphate to be able to replenish ATP so you can maintain high amounts of energy for muscle contraction. So that's the minimum time, and you have to get a quick start, a quick ramp up. And so by using these maximum intensity runs between 8 and 12 seconds, that's how you get the quick ramp up. To develop a larger capacity, that's when you need to do longer speed endurance or short special endurance.
Love this, love this. So, uh, go back to like you mentioned, like at the start and at the acceleration phase, athletes tend to have like hold their breath so they can have like maximal power output. Um, but nowadays there's like coaches discuss about things like spinal engine theory. Sorry about the pause. Spinal engine theory. So what exactly does like spinal engine theory goes to like sprinting, or your
So
thoughts on
I'm not understanding the word before theory.
spinal engine? Spinal. It's like,
Spinal
yeah,
spinal engine. I've never heard that before.
okay.
What's the
It's kind of like the uh lumbar flexion helps the leg create a torque.
lumbar flexion? So bending forward,
Side bending, sorry, side bending.
side bending
Yeah,
helps. No kidding. Never heard that. Don't understand I don't understand the mechanism at all.
sorry
What
about
I
that.
will tell you is body position is real important. And what we're finding with the young athletes is that they're hyperlordotic, and so that means the lumbar curve is excessive, which then tips the pelvis forward. And so you rotate the pelvis forward. The problem is when you rotate the pelvis forward, you shorten the one joint hip flexors. And so a muscle produces its greatest force at a length slightly greater than its resting length. Well, if you're tipping the pelvis forward and you're shortening your hip flexors, you're not going to generate the same amount of force. Why does this typically happen? Here's the scenario. Okay, an athlete maybe has a small injury, maybe it's a muscle strain in the leg. If not neurologically or an ankle sprain, for example, if not neurologically rehabilitated, the first thing that happens is the abdominal muscles are turned off. And when the abdominal muscles are turned off, especially the transverse abdominis and the internal and external obliques, because they come together in the front of the body, and then they wrap around the body and connect to what's called the thoracolumbar aponeurosis. It's a ligamentous band that's in the low back, and it's attached to the posterior processes of the lumbar vertebra and the thoracic vertebra. And so what happens is when you draw in, when you engage these wraparound muscles, that puts tension on the thoracolumbar aponeurosis, and that stabilizes the spine, stabilizes the lumbar spine posteriorly. If you don't have automatic control of this, and Mike Clark talks about it's a feed forward mechanism. These muscles have to fire to stabilize before other muscles fire. So it's feed forward, not feed back. And so if you've lost this automatic pattern, you have to retrain it. You have to get these muscles to re-engage. And there's a whole series of exercises that I've taken athletes through. And after 2 weeks, they say, Coach, my running is totally changed just because I can now have a flat back instead of an arched back. And so, and here's one way you can recognize if this is a problem with your athlete. If they pull up the shirt and you look at the muscles on both sides of the lumbar spine, if it looks like there are two cables or two ropes that are running up the spine, this is a hypertrophy of the erector spinae muscles. That means the erector spinae muscles have hypertrophied because they're now trying to be the prime stabilizers of the lumbar spine. When they contract, they end up squeezing the posterior aspect of the base of the vertebra, and they end up squeezing the intervertebral disc, and that takes and pops out the nucleus pulposa, and now you have a bulging disc, which then starts pressing on nerves, and now you get hamstring issues. And so I was just talking to one of our sprinters in the 4x1 relay pool, and it's either this situation or he has what's called synergistic dominance, and that then causes hamstring strains. So we want to make sure that they have this active control of the pelvis so they can flatten their back and keep the pelvis looking up. We like to tell our sprinters, keep it simple. Your pelvis is like a bowl of soup. You want to keep the soup in the bowl. What happens if you tip the bowl forward? The soup comes out. So don't spill the soup. And so they like that analogy because they can kind of see carrying a bowl of soup and then tipping it forward, and all of a sudden it's on the floor. And so we use a device called a Rotex, manufactured in the United States, it basically is like two turntables that you stand on. And what we do is we put the body up against the wall, we have the athlete flatten the back, and then we have them do internal rotation. And this engages the internal obliques specifically, and also the internal rotators of the at the hip joint, which are also oftentimes either turned off or weak. And this then allows the athlete to have better control of those wraparound muscles in the abdominal compartment.
Nice, nice. So, besides like things we mentioned, like do you have like, because like you have like tons of experience working with top sprinter in the world. So, for those coaches who want to learn more about like sprinting, more about like uh speed training, where can they reach out to you?
Well, I think the first thing is that there's probably more stuff on YouTube where I've given lectures and I've worked practical application with athletes and that type of thing. It's one of the best ways that they can kind of do that, and that's what the coaches in Hungary who can't get into Budapest on a regular basis. That's what they're kind of doing is they're googling they're googling Loren Seagrave and they're googling thigh pop and watching the progressions. As a matter of fact, on March 11th or on March 10th we're doing a coaches seminar here in Budapest, and basically we're going to be talking about active dynamic warm up, and we're going to be talking about maximum velocity sprinting and teaching progressions and that type of thing. And then the next day we'll have all of our 4x1 junior, under 20 team there, and we'll take them through the active dynamic warm up, and we'll take them through the teaching progression to work with them on their maximum velocity, and that'll be another 4-hour block. So 2 4-hour blocks that the coaches and the athletes are exposed to kind of what we're doing and what the thinking is behind it. I'm a firm believer that, you just don't have a coach's clinic. The coach has to bring the athletes. And so the athlete has then a more direct understanding of what they're doing. And then you physically take the athletes through the teaching progressions. And I'll have a couple of my senior athletes there to demonstrate the active dynamic warm-up and demonstrate the drills. And then they'll actually communicate in Hungarian with the young athletes so that they have a real good understanding of what to do. The coach then gets a chance to watch another coach or athlete working with their athlete and starts to understand, okay, this is how we coach. Because the worst thing that happens, and I see this all over the world, is the athlete stands 60 meters away from the finish line. The coach is on the finish line with a stopwatch, and they starts the watch when the athlete takes off, and they tell them, okay, 7.5. How is that going to change their motor pattern? So Wolfgang Riedsdorf and Ralf Mush-Bahani, 2 great German coaches, and I were in Singapore talking about, okay, well, what is coaching? Because coaching is not training. It's not the physical work that you do and write the programs and that kind of things. Maya Angelou, a famous philosopher, said, train animals, educate people. And so we're not just trying to change their physiological and components. We're trying to teach them how to be better sprinters. And so we came to the conclusion and agreed that coaching is teaching while training. And so one of the big things that coaches have adopted now is the most powerful tool that they have is in their hand. It's their cell phone. And we have many people now that have Dartfish Express on their cell phone so that they can take a video of the athlete and then show the athlete and slow things down, and they can see the motion. And most of us are visual learners. 75 to 80% of all the stuff that we know, we learn by the input of vision. A smaller percentage are kinesthetic learners. This is, if I can feel the movement, I can do the movement. And then a very small percentage are auditory learners. And women oftentimes say that men don't listen as well as women do. Well, that's true because women have language centers in both hemispheres of their brain. Men only have a language center in one hemisphere of the brain. And so if I describe the movement to you, it's hard for you to understand it. If I can see it, I can do it. If I can feel it, I can do it. If you tell me about it, probably not. And so getting athletes, if the other thing is, coach, if you can't demonstrate a teaching progression or a learning movement 100% correctly, don't demonstrate. Because what the athlete does is they're gonna emulate what you just did. And if it's not perfect, teach one of your athletes to have good movement patterns and be able to do the teaching progressions and learning progressions correctly, let them be the model. And so I was talking with a young hurdler yesterday. He was asking about, okay, what's the movement like in between the hurdles? And Zoltan, one of our Zoltans, was hurdling. He just turned 20 years old. Real high level hurdler, and he was executing the movement in between the hurdles extremely well. And I said, "Come here, watch him." And then I took a video and I asked Zoltan if I could show the video of him. He said, and his coach videos all the time. And so the athlete finally said, "Okay, I understand now what I have to do." And so, this is a very powerful way to teach. But coaches teach while training. Don't just be a stopwatch guy.
Love that. Love that. Love that. Coach, I appreciate for the time. I know I asked for an hour, so I'm gonna stop it right here. But I still have like tons of questions from uh the YouTube you mentioned or the online when I searched like Loren Seagrave, there's tons of like article about it. I still have a lot of questions from that. So can I like is it possible to do a second episode?
Certainly. My life is going to get crazy here as we're moving into relay training camps and that type of thing. I have my own athletes, and then I have the men's and women's 4x100 meter relay, as well as the under 20 4x100 meter relay. So it's going to be a bit of a zoo, but certainly we can get together at another point in time.
Appreciate it, coach.